The year was 1849, and the air in San Francisco smelled of salt water, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke of 1,000 cook fires burning in a city that had exploded overnight from 200 souls to 25,000. This was not a city. It was a fever dream. A sprawling tent encampment carved into the mud of the bay, where men arrived with golden visions and left with empty pockets and broken spines. The streets were rivers of filth. Horses sank to their bellies in the muck. Men fought with knives over a shovel, over a claim, over a perceived slight in a saloon where whiskey cost more than a week's labor. San Francisco in the gold rush was not the beginning of the American dream. It was the place where that dream came to die slowly, one broken promise at a time. The real money was not in the gold fields. The real money was in selling picks to the desperate, tents to the homeless, and hope to the hopeless. And standing on the dock in March of 1850, watching the chaos unfold with the cold calculation of a man who had already survived one exodus, was Levi Strauss. He was 20 years old, a Bavarian Jew who had fled Europe with his family to escape pogroms and poverty. He did not come for gold. He came with bolts of canvas, needles, thread, and the understanding that miners needed shelter more than they needed dreams. Strauss set up shop selling dry goods. Fabric, blankets, handkerchiefs. Boring, essential, profitable. He was a merchant, not a prospector, and he watched the parade of broken men with an entrepreneur's eye. They all had the same problem. Their pants didn't last. Cotton trousers would survive maybe 2 weeks in the Sierra Nevada gold fields before the knees tore out, the seat split, or the pockets ripped away under the weight of rock samples and tools. The men worked on their knees in gravel. They hauled ore. They crawled through mine shafts. And their pants, designed for Sunday church services and farm work, disintegrated like wet paper. One afternoon, a miner came into Strauss's shop and looked at the heavy brown canvas duck fabric stacked on the shelves. It was sailcloth meant for wagon covers and tents. The miner ran his hand over the material and said something that would echo through the next 150 years. You should have made pants out of that canvas instead of tents. At least then they'd last. Strauss heard the sentence. He didn't act on it immediately. That's the myth people tell, the instant eureka. The truth was slower, more calculated. But the seed was planted. Heavy fabric, reinforced construction. Pants that could survive the machinery of extraction. The problem was execution. Strauss wasn't a tailor. He was a businessman. In Reno, Nevada, 200 miles inland, there was a man named Jacob Davis. He was a Latvian Jewish immigrant, a tailor who worked out of a small shop making horse blankets, wagon covers, and custom clothing for workers. In 1870, a woman came into his shop. She was the wife of a woodcutter, and she was furious. Her husband was a large man, over 300 pounds, and he destroyed a pair of work pants every single week. The seams split, the pockets tore. She couldn't afford to keep replacing them. She wanted Davis to make a pair that would last. Davis looked at the problem like an engineer. Fabric wasn't the issue. You could use heavy duck, heavy denim. It didn't matter if the stress points failed. The pockets ripped because the stitching couldn't hold the weight of tools. The fly burst because the thread gave way under tension. The solution wasn't stronger thread. The solution was to stop relying on thread alone. Davis walked over to his workbench and picked up a handful of copper rivets. These were small fasteners used to attach leather straps to horse blankets. He took the rivets and hammered them into the corners of the pockets, at the base of the fly, at every point where the fabric experienced stress. Metal and fabric bonded together. The pants could not tear at the rivets. The copper would hold until the fabric around it rotted away, and even then, you could patch the fabric and the rivet would still be sound. The woodcutter's wife took the pants home. Her husband wore them every day for months. They did not fail, word spread. Men started coming to Davis asking for the riveted pants. He couldn't keep up with demand. But he had a problem. He couldn't afford the $68 fee to file a patent. If he didn't file, someone else would steal the design. So he wrote a letter to the man who supplied his fabric, Levi Strauss in San Francisco. The letter was desperate and brilliant. Davis explained the rivet process, explained the demand, and proposed a partnership. Strauss would pay for the patent, and they would split the profits. Strauss read the letter and saw the future of American labor in a copper rivet. On May 20, 1873, the United States Patent Office issued patent number 139,121 for improvement in fastening pocket openings. The empire was born. The first Levi Strauss Co. riveted waist overalls were not blue, they were brown, made from cotton duck canvas. The indigo blue denim came later, imported from the mills of the Ancients, France, a fabric the French called serge denims, which American tongues corrupted into denim. The rivets were copper because copper didn't rust. The stitching was orange because orange thread contrasted with the blue denim, making the quality of the stitching visible to the buyer. This wasn't decoration, it was proof of construction. The stitching on the back pockets formed a double arch pattern, a design that became so iconic it would eventually be trademarked. But originally, it was just reinforcement, a way to keep the pocket from sagging under the weight of a hammer or a tobacco tin. Strauss and Davis were not making fashion. They were making armor for the working class. The guarantee was simple and radical. If your pants ripped, bring them back and we'll give you a new pair. Not store credit, not a repair, a replacement. This was suicidal business practice in an era when most goods were sold with a shrug and a good luck. But Strauss understood something deeper. He was selling to men who had nothing. A miner, a railroad worker, a rancher. These men could not afford to waste money on a pair of pants that failed. If Levi's failed them, they would tell every man in the camp and the brand would die. But if Levi's lasted, those men would become evangelists. The iconic leather patch on the back waistband appeared in the 1880s. It depicted two horses pulling in opposite directions, trying to tear apart a pair of Levi's waist overalls. The horses couldn't do it. This wasn't metaphor. This was a documented test. The company actually harnessed horses to their pants to prove they were indestructible. The image was simple, stupid, and unforgettable. It told illiterate workers in a single glance that these pants were tougher than livestock. Levi Strauss didn't invent denim. He didn't invent rivets. He didn't invent pants. But he understood the American working man in a way that no other manufacturer did. He understood that a tool needed to be trusted. A man's pants were not a luxury. They were the barrier between his body and the saw blade, the barbed wire, the scalding steam pipe. If your pants failed at the wrong moment, you could lose your leg, your job, your life. Levi's wasn't selling clothing. Levi's was selling survival. By 1890, the factory on Valencia Street in San Francisco was a cathedral of industrial power. It did not smell like a department store. It smelled of raw indigo dye, a sharp, almost sweet chemical scent that clung to the lungs. It smelled of machine oil, of brass and copper being hammered and cut, of cotton fibers ground into dust by the friction of industrial sewing machines. The air was blue, not metaphorically. The indigo dye created a fine mist that hung in the air, staining the windows, the walls, the skin of the workers. If you worked at the Valencia Street factory, you went home with blue hands. You couldn't wash it off. It lived under your fingernails for weeks. The factory floor was a symphony of violence. Massive industrial sewing machines, some weighing over 500 pounds, punched through layers of 14-ounce denim with needles the size of nails. The noise was a constant hammering roar, a mechanical thunder that made conversation impossible. Women worked the sewing lines, their hands flying across the fabric, guiding the heavy denim through the machines with a precision that came from 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Men worked the cutting tables, using long industrial shears to slice through stacks of denim 20 layers thick. The rivet stations were the loudest. Workers would position the copper rivets by hand, then slam them into place with pneumatic hammers. The sound was a sharp, percussive crack, like a rifle shot, repeated thousands of times a day. The smell of hot metal mixed with the indigo and the oil. This was not artisan work, this was mass production. But the quality control was fanatical. Every seam was double-stitched. Every rivet was inspected. If a pair of pants had a flaw, a crooked seam, a weak rivet, it was pulled from the line and sold as a factory second at a discount. The first quality Levi's that left the Valencia Street factory were built to a standard that bordered on obsessive. These pants were designed to outlast the men who wore them. By the early 1900s, Levi's had conquered the West. Cowboys wore them because barbed wire didn't tear them. Ranchers wore them because they could be worn for weeks without washing and still hold their shape. Railroad workers wore them because the copper rivets didn't spark when you crawled under a train car. The pants became the unofficial uniform of American labor, but they were still invisible to polite society. These were work clothes. You didn't wear Levi's to church. You didn't wear them to a dinner. You wore them to dig a ditch, and then you took them off and put on real trousers. The first crack in this perception came from an unexpected place, Hollywood. In the 1930s, Western films exploded in popularity, and the costume designers needed authentic cowboy gear. They bought Levi's. Suddenly, movie stars were wearing riveted denim on screen, and the audience associated Levi's not with laborers, but with rugged, independent cowboys. It was a complete fabrication. Most real cowboys in the 1800s wore whatever they could afford, and Levi's were expensive. But the myth was more powerful than the truth. By the time the 1940s arrived, Levi's had been promoted from a tool to a symbol. Then came the war. In 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States was dragged into a global conflict that would consume the next 4 years. The War Production Board took control of American industry and declared certain materials to be strategic resources essential for the war effort. Copper was on that list. Copper was needed for bullet casings, for artillery shells, for wiring in bombers and battleships. Suddenly, Levi Strauss Co. could no longer use copper rivets in their pants. This should have killed the company. The copper rivet was the foundation of the brand. It was the innovation that had launched the empire. But Levi's adapted with a ruthlessness that would define the company for the next 80 years. They couldn't use copper rivets, so they used steel rivets painted to look like copper. The War Production Board also restricted thread. The orange stitching on the back pockets, the iconic arcuate design, used too much thread. So Levi's stopped stitching it. Instead, they painted the design onto the pockets with a stencil. It looked almost identical from a distance, but it was a lie. The stitching was gone. The pants still functioned, but a piece of the sole had been removed. There was one more change. The rivets on the back pockets, the ones that sat right where a man's rear end met a wooden chair, had always been a source of complaint. Soldiers sitting on wooden benches complained that the rivets scratched the furniture. In 1942, Levi's removed the back pocket rivets entirely. This decision, made in the chaos of wartime production, became permanent. The back pocket rivets never returned. But despite these compromises, Levi's survived the war. In fact, they thrived. Millions of young American men were drafted, shipped overseas, and issued uniforms. When they had leave, when they wanted to feel like civilians again, they wore Levi's. The pants became associated with freedom, with the American identity. When the war ended in 1945 and the soldiers came home, they brought that association with them. Levi's were no longer just work pants. They were the pants you wore when you wanted to feel like yourself. The post-war boom of the 1950s should have been the golden age for Levi's. The economy was roaring. Factories were hiring. The working class had money to spend. And Levi's had a brand that was synonymous with American labor. But something strange happened. The pants began to be worn by people who didn't work. Teenagers started wearing Levi's, not as work clothes, as a rebellion. In 1953, Marlon Brando starred in The Wild One. playing a motorcycle gang leader. He wore Levi's and a leather jacket. The image was electric. Brando wasn't a worker. He was a rebel, a dangerous, sexual, anarchic force. The pants were no longer a tool, they were a costume. 2 years later, James Dean wore Levi's in Rebel Without a Cause. Dean played a disaffected teenager, alienated from his parents, searching for meaning in a sterile suburban world. The Levi's he wore were not practical. They were symbolic. They said, "I reject your corporate world. I reject your white-collar uniformity." High schools across America started banning Levi's. They were too rebellious, too associated with delinquency and youth violence. This should have been a disaster for the brand. Instead, it was the greatest marketing campaign they never paid for. Teenage boys wanted to wear what their parents hated. Teenage girls started borrowing their boyfriends' Levi's, rolling up the cuffs, wearing them tight and low. The term dungarees was replaced by jeans, a word that sounded less like work and more like youth. Levi Strauss Co. was caught completely off guard. They had built a company on the idea that their pants were for laborers. Now suburban kids with no calluses on their hands were wearing them to be cool. The company had no idea how to market to this demographic, so they did nothing. They kept making the same pants, the same way, and the culture transformed around them. By 1960, Levi's were no longer exclusively work clothes. They were fashion. The 1960s were a cultural earthquake, and Levi's found themselves at the epicenter. The counterculture movement adopted denim as the anti-establishment uniform. Hippies wore Levi's to Woodstock in 1969, 500,000 people standing in the mud, united by their rejection of the Vietnam War, corporate America, and the nuclear family. And they were all wearing the pants that had been designed for gold miners. The irony was brutal. Levi's, a corporation, had become the symbol of anti-corporate rebellion. The hippies customized their Levi's. They embroidered flowers on the pockets. They sewed patches over the knees. They tie-dyed them, bleached them, ripped them intentionally. They turned the pants into art, into a personal statement. Levi Strauss Co. watched this happen with a mixture of horror and greed. On one hand, their brand was being associated with drug use and political radicalism. On the other hand, sales were exploding. In 1971, Levi Strauss Co. went public. The company that had been family-owned for nearly 100 years sold shares on the New York Stock Exchange. This decision was the beginning of the end. A public company has one mandate: grow. You cannot grow by selling indestructible pants to a finite population of workers. Workers buy one pair of Levi's and wear them for a decade. That's not growth. That's stagnation. To grow, you need to sell to people who don't need your product. You need to sell to people who will buy multiple pairs. You need to turn your tool into a fashion item. The 1970s brought a new enemy: designer jeans. Calvin Klein, Jordache, Sergio Valenti. These were not work pants. These were tight, tailored, expensive status symbols marketed to women and to men who wanted to look good, not work hard. A pair of Calvin Klein jeans cost $50 in 1978, nearly double the price of Levi's, and people bought them. Because they weren't buying durability, they were buying the label. They were buying the promise of sex appeal. Levi's tried to compete. They launched Levi's for Gals campaigns. They tried to make their pants tighter, more fashionable. They failed. Levi's was a truck trying to race a sports car. The DNA was wrong. The company had spent 100 years building a reputation for function, and now the market wanted form. The designer Zhang wore exposed a fundamental truth. Levi's had never been a fashion company. They were an industrial company that made pants, and now the market wanted fashion. In 1986, Levi's launched Dockers, a line of khaki pants aimed at the business casual market. Dockers were soft, comfortable, easy to wash, and utterly soulless. They were the opposite of Levi's. They required no break-in period. They had no personality. They were beige noise. But they sold. Because the American workplace was changing. Factories were closing, white-collar jobs were growing. And white-collar workers didn't wear denim, they wore dockers. The 1990s were the decade of the betrayal. In 1993, Levi Strauss Co. announced they were closing the Valencia Street factory in San Francisco. The factory that had been the heart of the company for over 60 years was no longer profitable. Labor costs in America were too high. The company shifted production to Mexico, to Asia, to anywhere that could make the pants cheaper. The workers who had spent their lives sewing Levi's were laid off. The factory was eventually demolished. It's now a luxury condominium building where tech workers live and complain about the rent. The closure of Valencia Street was symbolic. Levi's was no longer an American manufacturing company. They were a brand management company that outsourced production. The quality began to collapse. The denim got thinner. The rivets were no longer copper. They were steel painted to look like copper. The stitching became inconsistent. Sizing became a nightmare. A pair of 500 ones made in Mexico fit differently than a pair made in Bangladesh. The legendary durability, the thing that had built the empire, was gone. Vintage Levi's from the 1960s and 70s started selling for $300, $500, sometimes over $1,000. Collectors hunted for jeans with the Made in USA tag, with real copper rivets, with the old-style stitching. The insult was clear. People trusted 40-year-old Levi's more than they trusted new ones. Then came the environmental reckoning. In the 2000s, journalists started investigating the denim industry, and what they found was horrific. Each pair of jeans required approximately 1,800 gallons of water to produce. The cotton fields were drowning in pesticides. The indigo dye, the iconic blue that had stained the hands of workers in San Francisco, was now poisoning rivers in Bangladesh and China. The factories used a process called sandblasting to create the pre-distressed, worn look that consumers wanted. Sandblasting involved spraying denim with high-pressure air mixed with sand particles. It looked great. It also gave workers silicosis, a fatal lung disease. Men in their 20s were dying because American teenagers wanted their jeans to look old. Levi's, to their credit, banned sandblasting in 2010. But the damage to the brand's reputation was done. The company that had once represented honest labor was now associated with sweatshops and environmental destruction. The 2010s brought a new existential threat: athleisure, yoga pants, joggers, stretchy fabrics that felt like wearing nothing. The term hard pants became an insult. Denim, the fabric that had armored miners and cowboys, was now seen as uncomfortable and restrictive. People wanted to feel like they were still wearing pajamas, even when they left the house. Levi's tried to adapt. They added stretch fabric to their denim. Elastan spandex blended into the cotton to make the jeans more comfortable. The purists were horrified. Stretch denim wasn't real denim. It didn't fade the same way. It didn't mold to your body. It was a compromise, a surrender, but it sold. Because the modern consumer didn't want to suffer through a break-in period. They wanted comfort immediately. The tech bro uniform, the Patagonia vest and joggers, replaced denim as the power symbol in Silicon Valley. Jeans became try-hard. They became the thing your dad wore. Gen Z, raised on comfort and convenience, rejected denim entirely. On TikTok, teenagers mocked millennials for wearing skinny jeans. The skinny jean, the style that had dominated the 2000s, died almost overnight. Thrift stores were flooded with discarded skinny Levi's, and Gen Z, when they did buy jeans, bought them secondhand. They hunted for vintage Levi's in thrift shops, but they didn't buy new ones. Levi's responded by launching the Levi's Vintage Clothing line, premium reproductions of classic designs from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. A pair of Levi's vintage clothing 500 ones could cost $300 or more. They were made with selvage denim, copper rivets, the old-style stitching. They were, in theory, identical to the original Levi's, but they weren't. Because they were sold in plastic packaging, in boutique stores, to people who would never wear them hard. They were museum pieces, tools that had been turned into trophies. The raw denim cult emerged. Obsessive consumers who bought unwashed, untreated denim and wore it for months, sometimes years, without washing it. They wanted the jeans to fade naturally, to develop creases and wear patterns that were unique to their body. This was the original ritual of Levi's, the break-in period that turned a stiff piece of fabric into a second skin. But for the raw denim cult, it wasn't about utility. It was about performance. It was about posting photos on Reddit to show off your sick fades. The jeans were still a costume, just a different kind. The modern Levi's consumer faces a paradox. Walk into a department store and you'll see Levi's 500 ones hanging next to t-shirts that say, "Live, Laugh, Love." They're sold at Target. They come in plastic bags with orange safety tags warning that the dye may bleed. The orange tag is supposed to be removed before wearing, but collectors leave it on. To remove it is to lower the resale value. To actually wear the jeans is to ruin them as collectibles. Levi's still manufactures millions of jeans every year. The company still exists, but it's a ghost. The soul of the brand, the connection to labor and durability, is gone. What's left is a logo and a vague sense of nostalgia. The two-horse leather patch is still there, but the promise it represents is a lie. Modern Levi's will fall apart in a washing machine. The rivets will fail, the seams will split. Not because the workers are incompetent, but because the company has optimized for cost, not quality. They're competing with H&M and Zara, brands that sell jeans for $20. To compete, you have to cut corners. You have to use thinner denim, cheaper rivets, faster production. The landfills of the world are filled with discarded jeans. 2 billion pairs of jeans are produced globally every year. The average American owns 7 pairs. Most of those jeans will be worn fewer than 10 times before they're thrown away. The stretch denim, the plastic fibers blended into the cotton, doesn't decompose. It breaks down into microplastics that leach into the soil and water. The rivers that were once poisoned by indigo dye are now poisoned by synthetic fibers. Levi's launched a sustainability line called Wellthread. The jeans are made with organic cotton, recycled fibers, and water-saving production techniques. They're expensive and they sell poorly. Because the modern consumer doesn't want to pay $200 for sustainable jeans when they can buy fast fashion jeans for $30. And the consumer who does care about sustainability is skeptical. They know that Levi's spent decades destroying the environment. A single sustainable product line feels like greenwashing, like a PR stunt designed to distract from the millions of unsustainable jeans still being produced. The tragedy of Levi's is not that they failed to adapt. They adapted constantly. They went from work pants to rebel uniform to fashion item to collector's piece. The tragedy is that every adaptation required them to betray the thing that made them special. To grow, they had to stop being durable. To compete with designer jeans, they had to sacrifice function for form. To survive fast fashion, they had to offshore production and cut quality. To appeal to modern consumers, they had to add stretch and comfort, destroying the break-in ritual that created the emotional bond. What did we trade? We traded stiff, uncomfortable denim that hurt for the first 6 months, but then molded to your body and lasted 20 years for stretchy, pre-faded denim that feels good immediately, but falls apart in 2 years. We traded copper rivets that burned your inner thigh when you sat too close to a campfire for plastic rivets that crack. We traded the ritual of maintaining your jeans, of repairing them when they tore, of passing them down to your son, for the convenience of throwing them away and buying new ones. We traded ownership for rental. A pair of vintage Levi's from 1965 was yours. It had your sweat in the fabric, your shape in the creases, your history in the fades. A modern pair of Levi's is generic. It's pre-distressed at the factory to look like it has history, but it's a fake history. It's nostalgia mass-produced and sold in a plastic bag. The factory on Valencia Street is gone. The sewing machines that thundered for 60 years are silent. The workers who knew how to rivet by hand, who could feel when the tension on a seam was wrong, are retired or dead. The knowledge of how to make a truly indestructible pair of jeans still exists, but it's not economically viable. You can't sell indestructible jeans in a world that demands quarterly growth. Indestructible jeans are a bad business model. They last too long. The Levi's empire was built on a copper rivet and a promise. The rivet is still there, stamped into the fabric at every stress point. But it's not copper anymore. It's steel painted to look like copper. And the promise, the guarantee that these pants would outlast you, is gone. The modern guarantee is a 30-day return policy. If your jeans rip after 31 days, that's your problem. George Blaisdell built the Zippo on the philosophy that a tool should last forever. Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis built Levi's on the same philosophy. Both companies discovered that forever is not profitable. The market doesn't reward durability. The market rewards planned obsolescence, design failure, the endless cycle of buying and discarding. We live in a world where a 60-year-old pair of Levi's is more valuable than a new pair. Where the jeans our grandfathers wore to build highways are still intact, but the jeans we bought last year are already pilling and fading in the wrong places. The two horses on the leather patch are still pulling, but they're not trying to tear the jeans apart anymore. They're trying to hold the brand together, and they're losing. The copper rivet is cold now. The orange stitching has faded to a dull yellow. The denim that once smelled of indigo and hard work now smells of chemical treatments and factory air. The jeans are still sold, millions of them. But the men who needed them, the miners and the cowboys and the railroad workers, are gone. And Levi's is no longer a promise. It's just a name stitched onto a pocket. We stopped working with our hands, and the pants that were designed for that work became irrelevant. We moved into offices and cubicles, and now into our homes, where we work in pajamas and call it professional. The tools of labor became costumes of nostalgia. And the empire of denim, built by workers for workers, collapsed the moment we stopped being workers. The jeans that built an empire are still here. But the empire is gone. And all that's left is blue fabric and a memory of a time when things were made to last, by people who believed that quality mattered more than quarterly profits. The lid is closed, the rivet is set, and the flame of craftsmanship that once burned in San Francisco has been extinguished by the cold wind of convenience. We wanted comfort. We got disposability. We wanted fashion. We lost function. We wanted to feel like rebels while sitting in air-conditioned offices. And Levi's gave us exactly what we asked for. But in the process, they destroyed the only thing that made them worth wearing in the first place. The dark secret behind Levi's is not a scandal. It's not corruption or crime. The dark secret is that we killed it. We demanded cheaper jeans, faster production, softer fabric, and easier care. And Levi's, desperate to survive in a market that no longer valued what they were good at, gave us exactly what we wanted. The empire didn't fall. We dismantled it, one purchase at a time, choosing convenience over durability, fashion over function, and disposable over permanent. The copper rivet is still there, but it holds nothing together anymore. The orange stitching is still visible, but it's just decoration now. The two horses are still pulling, but the jeans have already torn. And we're standing in the ruins of the empire, wearing stretchy, pre-faded, made-in-Bangladesh denim, wondering why nothing lasts anymore. The answer is simple. We stopped wanting it to last. And Levi's, built on the promise of permanence, couldn't survive in a world that worships the temporary.